The Thompsons had always dreamed of living away from the hustle and bustle of city life, where they could raise their children in a peaceful, remote area. When they found the cabin near Shadow Creek, nestled deep in the woods of northern Arizona, it seemed like the perfect place. Surrounded by nothing but tall pines and the soft trickling of the creek, the isolation was exactly what they were looking for. However, they had no idea that the land was haunted by something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, a skinwalker. The locals had mentioned strange occurrences in the area, but the Thompsons dismissed them as nothing more than small-town superstitions. What could possibly be so dangerous about the woods? At first, everything seemed fine. The air was crisp, the views were stunning, and the children loved exploring the nearby forest. It wasn't until their second week at the cabin that the strange occurrences began. One evening, as Michael Thompson sat on the front porch watching the sunset, he noticed something odd. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a large coyote standing at the edge of the woods, watching him. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring. "Look at that," Michael called to his wife, Sarah. "That's the biggest coyote I've ever seen." Sarah joined him on the porch, but by the time she arrived, the animal was gone. Michael shrugged it off, assuming it had lost interest and wandered back into the woods. But the next night, it returned, this time closer to the cabin. And the next night, it was even closer. Michael grew uneasy. Coyotes didn't typically behave this way. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew something was off. By the end of the week, the strange sightings had escalated. The family started hearing scratching sounds on the windows at night, low growls, and the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps outside the cabin. Michael had begun to sleep with a shotgun by the door, just in case. But no matter how many times he checked, he found nothing, only silence and darkness. One night, Sarah was putting their youngest daughter, Emily, to bed when the girl mentioned something that sent chills down her spine. "Mommy, there's a man outside," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah froze. "A man? What do you mean?" "He's out there. He has a coyote's head, but he's standing like a man. He watches me." Sarah's heart pounded. She tried to stay calm, assuring her daughter that it was just a dream, but deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. The stories she'd heard from the locals about skinwalkers, evil witches who could shape-shift into animals, came rushing back to her. That same night, the Thompsons' dog, Max, began barking frantically at the back door. Michael grabbed his shotgun, ready for whatever was out there, and opened the door to find the coyote standing just outside the tree line. Only, it wasn't a coyote. It stood upright, its yellow eyes locked onto Michael's. The creature was tall, towering over him, with the face of a coyote and the body of a human. The air around it seemed to buzz with a strange energy, like static electricity. For a moment, Michael was frozen, staring in disbelief at the thing before him. It was a skinwalker. Michael fired his shotgun, but the creature moved faster than any animal he'd ever seen, disappearing into the woods before the shot rang out. He stood on the porch, breathless, his hands shaking. "What was it?" Sarah asked, rushing to his side. Michael's voice trembled. "I don't know. But it's not human." From that night on, the Thompsons knew they were not alone. The skinwalker began tormenting them relentlessly. They heard its growls in the distance, felt its presence watching them at all hours, and even found strange, humanoid footprints around the cabin each morning. The children became terrified, refusing to go outside or sleep alone. One evening, while Michael was out chopping wood, the creature made its move. Sarah was inside, tidying up, when she heard heavy footsteps coming up the porch stairs. She turned and froze. Standing at the doorway was the skinwalker, its eyes burning bright yellow, its claws extended. Sarah screamed for Michael, but the creature moved quickly, slashing at the door, trying to get inside. The children cried as Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife, knowing it would be useless but desperate to protect her family. Just as the creature smashed through the window, Michael burst through the front door, shotgun in hand. He fired at the skinwalker, hitting it square in the chest. It let out an unearthly screech, stumbling back before retreating into the woods. "We're leaving," Michael shouted, gathering the children. "Now." They packed their essentials and fled the cabin that night, leaving behind their dream home and the nightmare that had come with it. The Thompsons never returned to the cabin at Shadow Creek. They sold the property and moved far away from the area, but the experience stayed with them forever. Though they escaped with their lives, they knew that the creature, the Skinwalker, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Rumors of strange animal sightings and eerie occurrences around Shadow Creek continued for years. The locals knew the truth, though many never spoke of it. Shadow Creek was haunted by something ancient and evil, something that wasn't easily explained. And the Thompsons? They learned the hard way that some legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. It was supposed to be just another late-night drive. A group of friends, Jake, Mark, Lily, and Emma, were returning from a weekend camping trip deep in the Arizona wilderness. They had taken a detour to avoid traffic, opting for the quieter, more desolate roads. The barren stretch of highway they found themselves on was known to locals as Route 94, a road with a dark reputation. Unfamiliar with the area and not aware of its legends, the group drove on, laughing and joking to keep themselves awake as midnight approached. But Route 94 held more than just silence and isolation, it was said to be cursed. Travelers who passed through this remote highway often spoke of strange sightings, unsettling sounds, and, most disturbingly, vanishing animals that left no trace behind. What the friends didn't realize was that they were not alone. Something sinister was watching them from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was Emma who saw it first. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice cutting through the chatter. The others fell silent as she pointed out the window, her face pale. "What?" Jake, who was driving, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "I didn't see anything." "There, on the side of the road." Emma insisted. "It looked like an animal. A coyote, I think." Jake shook his head. "There's nothing out here, Em. You're just tired." But Emma wasn't convinced. As they continued down the highway, the group grew quiet, and a sense of unease settled over them. Moments later, Lily, who sat in the passenger seat, saw something dart out into the road. "Jake, stop," she yelled. Jake slammed on the brakes just as a large shape bolted across the road. The car screeched to a halt, skidding to a stop in the middle of the highway. They all stared out of the windshield, hearts pounding, as a coyote stood motionless in front of them, illuminated by the headlights. Except, something was wrong. The coyote was larger than any of them had ever seen, its yellow eyes glowing unnaturally in the beams of the car's lights. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared, unblinking, as if watching them, calculating. The group held their breath, frozen in place. "Should we?" Mark began to ask, but before he could finish, the coyote sprinted off into the darkness, disappearing into the desert. The group sat in silence for several moments, their nerves rattled by the eerie encounter. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "That was weird, right? Coyotes don't just do that." "Yeah, no kidding," Mark replied, his voice shaky. "Maybe we should just keep driving." Lily nodded, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the coyote had vanished. "Yeah, let's get out of here." They continued driving, but the tension in the car was palpable. Every few minutes, someone would glance out the window, scanning the dark desert landscape for any sign of movement. The once lively conversation had died down, replaced by the oppressive quiet of the open road. Then, the knocking started. It was soft at first, a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the car. Lily heard it first, but she didn't say anything, brushing it off as her imagination. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more insistent, like something, or someone, was knocking on the back of the car. She turned to Emma, who sat in the back seat. "Did you hear that?" Lily asked. Emma nodded, her face pale. "Yeah. I've been hearing it for a few minutes now." Jake glanced at them through the rearview mirror. "What are you guys talking about?" "Someone's knocking," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. Jake frowned and was about to respond when suddenly, the car lurched. The engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered. The car slowed to a crawl as Jake frantically pressed on the gas pedal, but it was no use, the car was dying. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, pulling over to the side of the road as the car came to a complete stop. The group sat in stunned silence for a moment before Jake opened the door. "I'll check the engine." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "Something doesn't feel right." But Jake, determined to get the car working again, stepped out into the darkness. As Jake inspected the engine, Mark and Emma exchanged nervous glances. The air outside the car felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of wind blowing through the desert. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the night. "Jake, get back in the car!" Lily shouted from the passenger seat. Jake looked up just in time to see something move in the shadows near the edge of the road. His breath caught in his throat as the figure of a coyote emerged from the darkness. But this time, it wasn't alone. Several figures, twisted and unnatural, lurked behind it. Their glowing eyes pierced the night, watching him. Jake stumbled backward, his heart racing. "Get in the car. Lock the doors." He bolted back to the car, slamming the door shut as the others scrambled to lock the doors. The figures outside crept closer, their shapes shifting and contorting in ways that defied logic. These weren't just animals, they were skinwalkers, evil beings from Navajo legend capable of taking on the form of animals and humans. The knocking resumed, louder and more violent than before, as if something was trying to break in. The skinwalkers circled the car, their forms flickering between human and beast. "They're trying to get in," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "We need to get out of here." With a final jolt, the car roared to life. Jake slammed on the gas, speeding down the highway as fast as the car would go. The skinwalkers chased them, their forms running unnaturally fast alongside the car, their glowing eyes tracking every move. Just when it seemed like they would never escape, the highway lights appeared in the distance. The skinwalkers slowed, disappearing back into the darkness as the car sped towards civilization. The group didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. When they finally pulled into a gas station, they sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell were those things?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever they were, we're never taking this road again." They never returned to Route 94, and none of them spoke of the night they encountered the skinwalkers again. But the memory of those glowing eyes and the sound of knocking haunted them for years, a constant reminder that there are things out there, lurking in the darkness, that we're not meant to understand. James Farley had always been comfortable with solitude. As a night watchman, his job was to patrol the sprawling construction site on the outskirts of town. The silence and isolation never bothered him, in fact, he found it calming. The site was a massive project, an office complex set against a dense, forested area that gave the place a remote, eerie feel. But as the weeks passed, James began noticing strange occurrences. Whispers, shapes shifting in the shadows, and unexplainable animal sounds echoed through the quiet nights. The locals had their own theories. The area, they claimed, was haunted by a skinwalker, an ancient shapeshifter from Native American legend known for its ability to mimic animals and even humans. James dismissed the rumors as old superstitions. But as the sounds grew louder, and the sightings more frequent, he began to fear that there was something very real lurking in the dark. James first noticed something strange one night around midnight. He was doing his usual rounds, flashlight in hand, when he heard a soft rustling near the edge of the site. At first, he thought it was just a stray animal. Coyotes often wandered close to the site, their howls echoing through the woods. But this sound was different. It was soft, almost like the quiet shuffle of footsteps, yet too quick and irregular to be human. James shrugged it off, figuring it was just his imagination, and continued on his route. But as he walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He scanned the area, his flashlight cutting through the dark, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the silence around him felt unnatural. Then, as he reached the far end of the construction site, he saw it, a large coyote standing just outside the fence, its yellow eyes reflecting back at him in the beam of his flashlight. It was massive, larger than any coyote he'd ever seen, with a coat that almost seemed to ripple in the night air. "Shoo!" he called, waving his arms. But the coyote didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, unblinking. James felt a chill crawl up his spine as he locked eyes with the animal. He turned his back for a moment to continue his patrol, and when he looked back, the coyote had vanished. After that night, the encounters became more frequent. Every evening, as James made his rounds, he would hear strange sounds, scratching against metal, footsteps echoing through the empty frames of unfinished buildings, and, more disturbingly, a low, growling voice that seemed to whisper his name. One night, he decided to investigate the source of the scratching sound. He followed it to the far side of the site, where a large storage container stood. His heart pounded as he approached, the scratching growing louder and more frantic. When he opened the container, he found nothing. But as he turned to leave, he felt a rush of cold air and heard a raspy voice behind him. "James." He whipped around, his flashlight trembling in his hand, but no one was there. His heart racing, he backed away, closing the container and quickly returning to his small security booth at the entrance of the site. He locked the door, feeling a rare sense of fear as he sat alone in the dim light, every shadow in the room seeming darker and more ominous. The following night, James came prepared, determined to confront whatever was haunting the construction site. He carried a camera and his flashlight, his nerves on edge as he made his way around the grounds. The site was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. He scanned every corner, every shadow, but saw nothing. As he neared the edge of the site, he saw it again, the massive coyote. But this time, it was different. The creature stood on two legs, hunched over, its fur matted and wild. Its face was twisted, almost human-like, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. It let out a low growl, and James felt paralyzed, unable to look away from its gaze. The creature took a step forward, its eyes locked onto his. James tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead, frozen in place as the creature slowly approached. The air grew colder, and he could hear the creature whispering, its voice raspy and filled with malice. "James, you shouldn't be here." The voice was chillingly human, mocking him, and yet layered with something ancient and inhuman. He finally snapped out of his trance, stumbling backward as he raised his flashlight, shining it directly at the creature. It recoiled, hissing in pain, its face contorting in anger. He turned and ran, his flashlight bobbing as he sprinted back toward the security booth, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it over his footsteps. Behind him, he could hear the creature's heavy, rapid footsteps gaining on him, its growls echoing through the empty site. James reached the booth, slamming the door shut and locking it. He stood there, breathless, waiting for the creature to appear at the window, but there was only silence. The night stretched on, the quiet more unsettling than any sound. He kept his flashlight aimed at the door, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, until the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. James never returned to the construction site after that night. He quit his job, moved out of town, and avoided any talk of the Skinwalker or the strange happenings at the site. But he couldn't escape the nightmares. Every night, he would see the creature's twisted face, its yellow eyes staring at him, its voice whispering his name in the darkness. Rumors spread through town about the Skinwalker haunting the construction site. Some claimed to hear strange noises when they passed by, while others saw shadows moving through the unfinished buildings. The site was eventually abandoned, left to decay as the legend of the Skinwalker grew. For James, the memory of that night haunted him for the rest of his life. The feeling of being watched, of hearing his name whispered in the dark, lingered with him like a curse. He never spoke of it again, but he knew, deep down, that the Skinwalker was still out there, waiting, watching, and whispering in the shadows. Tom Reyes had been looking forward to his solo hiking trip through the Arizona desert for months. As a seasoned hiker, he'd always found peace in the solitude of the wilderness, far from the noise and chaos of the city. The wide-open desert, with its vast landscapes and endless horizons, felt like home. But this particular stretch of desert, known by locals as Coyote Valley, had a darker reputation. Stories circulated about mysterious disappearances, strange sightings, and whispers of an ancient shape-shifting creature known as the Skinwalker. Tom had heard the legends, of course, but he was not easily frightened. He shrugged off the warnings, dismissing them as superstitions. But as he set out on his hike, he had no idea that he was being watched, stalked by a creature that would turn his dream hike into a fight for survival. The first day of the hike was uneventful. Tom followed a narrow trail that wound through red rock canyons and wide desert plains, basking in the silence. But as the sun began to set, a feeling of unease crept over him. It was the kind of instinctual dread that tingled down his spine and made the hairs on his arms stand up. He told himself it was just the isolation, the kind that always took a little getting used to. Setting up camp for the night, Tom gathered firewood and settled down as the desert grew darker. The stars emerged, filling the sky, and he relaxed, soaking in the tranquility. But as he drifted off, a distant sound broke the silence, a low, eerie howl carried on the wind. He sat up, listening intently. It was faint, but he could tell it was not like any coyote he'd ever heard. As the howls grew closer, he began to sense movement just beyond the light of his campfire. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, quick and fleeting, as though something was circling his camp. He called out, shining his flashlight toward the darkness, but there was nothing there. Or so he thought. He convinced himself it was just wildlife passing by, though the unease remained as he finally lay down to sleep, his flashlight close by. The next day, Tom set out early, trying to shake off the memory of the night. He pushed forward, determined to enjoy his hike, but as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every so often, he would catch a glimpse of movement in the distance, a flash of fur, a shadow darting behind rocks. But every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. By midday, his nerves were frayed. He found himself looking over his shoulder constantly, his heart racing at every sound. It was then that he noticed the footprints. They weren't human, but they also weren't quite animal. The prints were larger than any coyote or mountain lion, with claw marks that seemed almost humanoid. A chill ran down his spine as he stared at the tracks, realizing that they had been following him for miles. Whoever, or whatever, was leaving these tracks was stalking him. Nightfall came quickly in the desert, and Tom set up his camp, feeling more exposed than ever. He built a fire larger than the night before, hoping it would keep whatever was following him at bay. But as he sat by the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness, the strange howls returned, louder this time, as if they were closing in. Around midnight, Tom was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy moving near his tent. He grabbed his flashlight, his heart pounding, and slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. Just beyond the firelight stood a coyote, or at least, something that looked like a coyote. It was larger than any he'd ever seen, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of yellow, and its posture was all wrong. It stood still, watching him with an unsettling intelligence, as though it knew exactly what he was thinking. "Get out of here!" Tom yelled, grabbing a rock and throwing it at the creature. The coyote didn't move. Instead, it began to shift, its form stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic. Slowly, it stood on two legs, its body twisting and reshaping until it was something that resembled a man with the head of a beast. Its eyes never left his. Frozen in terror, Tom tried to comprehend what he was seeing, but his instincts took over. He backed away, his hand trembling as he held his flashlight. The creature took a step toward him, a low growl rumbling from its chest. "Stay away!" Tom shouted, but his voice shook with fear. The creature let out a chilling laugh, a sound that was eerily human yet filled with malice. It began to circle him, its eyes never blinking, its breath hot and foul in the night air. Tom realized then that he was being hunted, that this creature was not merely trying to scare him but intended to make him its prey. Desperate, Tom grabbed his hiking knife, the only weapon he had. The Skinwalker lunged at him, its claws extended, and he swung the knife, grazing its arm. The creature howled in pain, staggering back, its eyes flashing with rage. But instead of retreating, it circled him, moving closer with each pass, testing his defenses. Tom backed toward his campfire, holding the knife out in front of him. He knew the fire was his only advantage. He grabbed a burning branch, waving it toward the creature, hoping the flames would keep it at bay. The Skinwalker hissed, retreating from the fire's heat, but its eyes never left him, watching with a hunger that sent chills through his body. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Tom lunged forward, thrusting the flaming branch toward the creature. It howled, recoiling from the flames, and for a brief moment, it backed away, its shape shifting and contorting in the shadows. Taking advantage of the creature's hesitation, Tom grabbed his backpack and ran, never looking back. He sprinted through the desert, his heart pounding, the sounds of the skinwalker's growls fading into the distance as he put as much space between himself and the creature as he could. When dawn finally broke, Tom found himself near the edge of the desert, exhausted but alive. He staggered into the nearest town, collapsing at a gas station. The locals gathered around him, listening as he recounted his encounter, his words frantic and filled with terror. One of the older men shook his head, his face grim. "You've encountered the Skinwalker," he said quietly. "They don't like it when strangers wander into their territory." Tom nodded, too shaken to respond. He knew he'd never forget those glowing yellow eyes, the twisted shape, and the chilling laugh that still echoed in his mind. He vowed never to return to Coyote Valley, knowing that some places were better left unexplored, haunted by creatures we are not meant to see. And as he left the desert behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Skinwalker was still watching, waiting for its next victim to venture into the wilderness. Rachel Morrison had always felt safe in her quiet suburban neighborhood. Nestled in a small town in Colorado, the area was full of cozy homes with manicured lawns and tall, leafy trees. Nothing ever happened in her neighborhood, and that was how she liked it. But one summer, strange occurrences began to disrupt the peace. The neighbors started hearing unusual sounds at night, and pets went missing without a trace. People whispered that there was something unnatural in the area, but Rachel dismissed it as wild imagination. However, after one eerie encounter, Rachel realized that something sinister was lurking in her neighborhood, a skinwalker, an ancient, malevolent creature with the ability to shape-shift. And it was far closer than she had ever imagined. It started small. One night, Rachel heard scratching sounds outside her bedroom window. It was faint, but enough to wake her up. She brushed it off as a stray cat or raccoon and went back to sleep. The next morning, however, she noticed scratch marks on her windowpane, long and deep, as though someone, or something, had tried to claw its way inside. She shivered at the sight but told herself it was probably just an animal. A few days later, her neighbor Mrs. Daniels knocked on her door, looking pale and worried. "Have you seen Max?" Mrs. Daniels asked, referring to her old Labrador. Rachel shook her head. "No, I haven't." "Did he wander off?" "He was in the backyard last night, and this morning, he's just gone. No tracks, no sign of him." Rachel sympathized, but pets sometimes escaped, she reasoned. Yet, as days turned into weeks, more neighbors began reporting similar disappearances. Cats, dogs, even the occasional chicken from a backyard coop, all vanished without a trace. The mood in the neighborhood became tense, and as more animals went missing, Rachel began to grow uneasy. One night, as she sat watching TV, Rachel heard something outside again. This time, it was more than just scratching, it sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving along the side of her house. She muted the television, straining her ears to listen. Her heart pounded as she realized that whatever was outside wasn't an animal. She grabbed her phone and carefully made her way to the front door, peeking out through the blinds. At first, she saw nothing. But then, near the edge of her yard, a dark figure appeared. It was large, hunched over, with long limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. She gasped, instinctively stepping back, and the figure seemed to sense her movement. It turned, looking directly at her window. Her blood ran cold as she realized that it wasn't a human or an animal, it was something in between. Its eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she felt paralyzed, unable to look away. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the creature slipped back into the darkness. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her room, her mind racing with fear. Had she really seen what she thought she had? The stories of skinwalkers she'd heard as a child resurfaced in her mind, evil beings that could take on the form of animals or humans, using their powers to torment and harm those who encountered them. The following night, Rachel heard the sounds again, but this time, they were louder and closer. She stayed inside, gripping her phone tightly, prepared to call the police. But when she peeked out her window, she saw something that stopped her cold. There, in the middle of her yard, stood her neighbor's missing dog. Mac's relief washed over her at first, but as she looked closer, she noticed something was terribly wrong. Max's eyes glowed unnaturally, the way they did when she'd seen the creature. His posture was strange, almost like he was struggling to hold himself upright. And as he stood there, he let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. Max wasn't Max. Her mind raced, recalling the stories of skinwalkers and their terrifying abilities to mimic the appearance of animals. She slowly backed away from the window, watching as Max continued to stare at her house, unmoving. She called her friend Lisa, hoping for some reassurance, but Lisa only listened in silent horror as Rachel described the sight. That's a skinwalker, Rachel. You need to stay inside and lock your doors, Lisa said, her voice filled with fear. Rachel hung up, her heart pounding. She double-checked every lock in her house and turned off all the lights, hoping to make it through the night without another sighting. She sat in the dark, her nerves on edge, listening to every creak and sound from outside. The scratching returned, relentless and insistent, as though the creature was trying to find a way inside. The next evening, Rachel had finally had enough. She decided to confront whatever was stalking her. She armed herself with a flashlight and a heavy metal bat, determined to put an end to the terror that had plagued her and her neighbors. As night fell, she waited by her window, watching the yard. Hours passed, and just when she began to think the creature wouldn't return, she saw it. Standing at the edge of her yard, shifting between shadows, was the skinwalker. It had taken the form of a coyote this time, but its eyes still glowed with that unnatural yellow hue. Steeling herself, Rachel stepped outside, her bat gripped tightly in her hands. The creature's head snapped up, and it watched her, its eyes narrowing. She took a step forward, raising her bat, and the skinwalker growled, its body contorting and shifting. "You're not welcome here," she shouted, her voice trembling but strong. The skinwalker snarled, baring its teeth as it began to approach her. But before it could attack, she swung the bat with all her might, the metal connecting with its side. The creature let out an inhuman screech, stumbling back, its form flickering between human and animal. Rachel seized the moment, grabbing her flashlight and shining it directly into its eyes. The creature recoiled, hissing, its form shifting wildly as it backed away. With one last growl, it turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness beyond her yard. Rachel returned to her home, locking the doors and breathing a sigh of relief. She knew it was only a temporary victory, but the skinwalker hadn't returned since that night. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The missing pets were never found, but the strange noises and sightings stopped. Rachel never forgot the glowing eyes or the creature's twisted, shifting form. The neighborhood eventually moved on, but whispers about that summer lingered in hushed conversations. And while she rarely spoke of it, she knew that the skinwalker was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for its next prey. As for Rachel, she never felt entirely safe in her home again. Every night, she checked her locks twice, always listening for the faint sound of scratching at her window, just in case the skinwalker decided to return. Darren, Lily, and Evan were avid paranormal investigators, always on the hunt for their next thrilling adventure. They had explored abandoned asylums, haunted cemeteries, and even remote woods rumored to be haunted. But nothing excited them more than the stories of a skinwalker's lair deep in the forests of New Mexico. They had heard whispers of a cave that locals avoided at all costs, a place said to be the den of a skinwalker, a creature known in Navajo legend for its ability to transform into animals and torment those who dared to cross it. For Darren, Lily, and Evan, the stories were too good to pass up. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and a healthy dose of skepticism, the three friends set off into the dense forest, determined to find the legendary lair. Little did they know, they were about to enter a nightmare that would change their lives forever. The hike to the supposed lair was grueling. The trail was overgrown, winding through thick trees and rocky terrain, making the journey slow and exhausting. They could feel the temperature dropping as they ventured deeper into the forest, the air heavy with an eerie stillness. After hours of hiking, they finally reached the entrance to the cave. It was partially hidden by tangled vines and moss-covered rocks, giving it an almost unnatural appearance. The mouth of the cave was wide and dark, like a silent invitation into the unknown. The three friends stood there, staring into the pitch blackness, each feeling a growing sense of unease. "Are we sure we want to do this?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Evan shrugged. "We've come this far. Besides, if it's real, think about the footage we could get." With that, they switched on their flashlights and stepped inside. The air inside the cave was cold and damp, and the walls seemed to press in on them as they walked. Shadows danced along the jagged rock, creating twisted shapes that seemed to reach out from the darkness. Strange symbols were scratched into the walls, old and faded, yet unmistakably purposeful. They looked like warnings, though none of them could decipher what they meant. As they moved further into the cave, the strange symbols became more frequent. Darren ran his fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves in the rock. They seemed almost alive, buzzing faintly under his touch. They found strange bones scattered throughout the cave, arranged in small piles. Some were from animals, but others, they couldn't be sure. A chill ran down Lily's spine as she picked up a small bone, examining it closely. "These look recent," she said, glancing uneasily at the others. Evan was trying to brush off the rising tension, but even he felt the weight of the atmosphere. "It's just a cave," he muttered, though his voice wavered. As they ventured deeper, a strange smell began to fill the air, something rotten, metallic, and sickly sweet. The scent grew stronger with every step, and they found themselves covering their noses, feeling nauseated. Then, they heard it. A low growl echoed through the cave, reverberating off the walls. It was deep and guttural, unlike any animal they had ever heard. They froze, their flashlights shaking as they pointed them toward the sound. But all they saw was darkness. "What was that?" Darren whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "Probably just an animal," Evan replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe a coyote or something." But Lily shook her head. "Coyotes don't sound like that." As they stood there, trying to make sense of the sound, they heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from the darkness ahead. The growl returned, louder this time, and closer. The footsteps quickened, moving toward them at an unnatural speed. "Run!" Darren yelled, grabbing Lily's arm and pulling her back toward the entrance. But as they turned to flee, they saw a figure blocking their path. The creature stood tall, hunched slightly, with glowing yellow eyes that pierced through the darkness. It had the face of a wolf, but its body was twisted and unnatural, like something caught between human and animal. Its fur was matted, and its long claws scraped against the rock floor. The friends backed away, their breaths shallow, their hearts racing. They had stumbled into the lair of a skinwalker. The creature let out a snarl, its eyes fixed on them as it took slow, measured steps forward. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and Darren felt his legs weaken as he locked eyes with the creature, paralyzed by fear. Lily gripped her flashlight tightly, her hand trembling as she raised it toward the creature. The light seemed to anger it, and it let out an ear-piercing scream, its face contorting in rage. Evan stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror as he fumbled for his camera, but his hands shook so badly that he dropped it. The skinwalker moved closer, its gaze shifting between each of them, as if deciding which one to attack first. Darren felt his back press against the wall of the cave, realizing there was no escape. They were trapped. With a burst of courage, Lily grabbed a rock from the cave floor and threw it at the creature. It struck the skinwalker on the shoulder, causing it to pause, but only for a moment. It turned its gaze to her, snarling, and Lily felt a chill run through her as it took a step closer. "Go!" she screamed, pushing Darren and Evan toward the side of the cave. They bolted, running blindly through the darkness, desperate to find a way out. The skinwalker followed, its footsteps echoing off the cave walls as it chased them. Its growls grew louder, filled with anger and malice, as it closed in on them. Just when they thought they were done for, they saw a sliver of moonlight up ahead. The entrance to the cave was just a few yards away. With renewed energy, they sprinted toward the light, feeling the creature's hot breath on their backs. They burst out of the cave, stumbling into the cool night air, their hearts pounding. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest, the skinwalkers' enraged howls echoing behind them. They finally stopped, gasping for breath, their minds racing to process what they had just experienced. None of them spoke for several minutes, too shaken to put their terror into words. What was that?" Evan finally managed, his voice shaking. "A skinwalker," Darren replied, his face pale. "We just walked into its lair." The three friends left the forest that night, never speaking of the skinwalker's lair again. They abandoned their equipment, leaving behind the cameras, flashlights, and evidence they had collected. They knew that nothing they had brought with them could capture the horror of what they had seen. For weeks, they were haunted by nightmares of the creature's glowing eyes and snarling face. They avoided the forest and warned anyone who would listen to stay far away from the cave. The locals said the Skinwalker would haunt anyone who entered its lair, and each of them believed it, now more than ever. To this day, the cave remains undisturbed, hidden in the forest, avoided by anyone who knows the truth. And though the friends moved on with their lives, none of them ever forgot the night they looked into the eyes of the Skinwalker. Raymond Green had been a hunter all his life. For decades, he'd tracked everything from deer and elk to the occasional coyote that wandered too close to livestock. His knowledge of the wilderness made him a legend in his small community in northern Arizona. Nothing frightened him, and nothing in the forest surprised him, until the night he went hunting and encountered something that defied every instinct, something far deadlier than any animal. Raymond didn't believe in superstitions, so when he heard whispers of a skinwalker in the woods, he laughed it off as local lore. But by the end of his hunting trip, he'd come to realize that some legends weren't just stories, they were warnings. It was a cold October evening when Raymond set out into the woods, aiming to track a large buck he'd spotted earlier that week. The forest was silent, the only sound the soft crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, his flashlight in hand as he scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The hunt began like any other. Raymond found tracks easily, following the trail deeper into the forest, each step bringing him closer to his quarry. But as night began to fall, he sensed something was off. The forest felt unusually quiet. There were no animal calls, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling stillness that gnawed at his instincts. Then he heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush, followed by the distinct snap of a branch. Raymond froze, scanning the shadows. His eyes caught a glimpse of movement, something was stalking him. His pulse quickened, but he steadied himself, convinced it was the buck he'd been tracking. But as he moved forward, his flashlight caught a glimpse of something else, eyes. Large, glowing yellow eyes that stared at him from the darkness. It wasn't the buck he was hunting, it was a coyote, far larger than any he'd ever seen. The coyote stood motionless, its eyes unblinking, watching him with an unnatural intensity. Raymond raised his rifle, aiming toward the creature, but as he looked through the scope, it vanished, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. Shaken, Raymond continued his search, telling himself it was just a trick of the light. But as he ventured further into the forest, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few steps, he would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows that flickered and disappeared, quick and silent. He picked up the pace, moving deeper into the forest. His heart pounded as he tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. But then he heard it again, the sound of footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, echoing through the trees, moving in sync with his own. It was as if someone, or something, was mirroring his every step. Raymond stopped, gripping his rifle tightly, and turned to face the direction of the sound. That's when he saw it. The coyote had returned, but this time, it wasn't alone. Two other figures stood behind it, their shapes shifting and contorting in the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. They watched him, their forms flickering between human and animal, as though caught in a state of transformation. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, he was being hunted. A chill ran down Raymond's spine as he took a step back, his mind racing. He'd heard the stories of skinwalkers, witches who could transform into animals, using dark magic to curse or harm those they targeted. He had never believed them, but as he stood there, face to face with creatures that defied explanation, doubt began to creep in. One of the figures moved forward, its shape shifting and stretching until it resembled a grotesque mix of human and coyote. Its face twisted into a snarl, revealing sharp teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. The creature let out a low, guttural growl that sent a jolt of fear through Raymond. He raised his rifle, his hands shaking as he aimed at the creature. But before he could fire, it lunged at him, moving faster than anything he'd ever seen. He stumbled back, pulling the trigger, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the trees. The creature dodged, moving in a blur, and vanished into the shadows. Raymond's heart raced as he scanned the darkness, his flashlight flickering as he tried to regain his composure. But the skinwalker wasn't done. It let out a chilling laugh, a sound that was both human and animal, filling the forest with a sense of malice. "You're in our territory," the voice growled, distorted and echoing through the trees. Realizing he had no other choice, Raymond planted his feet, gripping his rifle tightly as he prepared to face the skinwalkers head-on. The creatures moved toward him, their shapes shifting in the moonlight, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice echoing through the ravine. One of the skinwalkers stepped forward, its form flickering between human and coyote. It snarled, baring its teeth as it lunged at him. Raymond fired, the shot hitting the creature square in the chest. It let out a pained scream, stumbling back as its form shifted wildly, struggling to maintain its shape. Seizing the opportunity, Raymond grabbed his flashlight, shining it directly into the creature's face. The skinwalker recoiled, its eyes narrowing in pain, and he took a step forward, driving it back with the light. The other creatures backed away, their forms flickering as they retreated into the shadows. With a final snarl, the creatures vanished, their laughter fading into the night. Raymond stood there, his flashlight trembling in his hand, his breath ragged as he tried to process what had just happened. Raymond made his way back to town, never looking back, his mind replaying the events of that night over and over. He returned shaken, but alive, forever haunted by the memory of the skinwalkers and their twisted, shifting forms. He never spoke of the encounter, but the locals noticed a change in him. He no longer hunted alone, and he never ventured into the woods after dark. The legend of the skinwalkers became more than just a story to him, it was a warning, a reminder that some things in the wilderness were beyond understanding, beyond reason, and beyond any weapon he could wield. The forest never seemed the same, and though Raymond lived out the rest of his days in quiet solitude, he knew the skinwalkers were still out there, waiting, stalking, hidden in the shadows, haunting the land that was theirs to claim. Ben and Charlie were childhood friends with a shared passion for the outdoors. Every fall, they planned a hiking trip to a new location, spending days exploring remote mountains and challenging trails. This year, they chose the Mogollon Mountains in New Mexico, a rugged, isolated stretch of wilderness that promised adventure. The area was known for its beautiful landscapes, but the locals had warned of strange sightings in the mountains, stories of a creature that could take on the shape of animals to deceive anyone who ventured too far. They called it a skinwalker. The two friends brushed off the warnings, eager to spend a few days away from the world. But as they hiked deeper into the mountains, they soon realized they were not alone. Something was following them, and it was far more dangerous than any wild animal. The first 2 days were uneventful. Ben and Charlie enjoyed the solitude, setting up camp by a river and watching the stars as they reminisced about old times. But on the third day, things began to take a strange turn. They were several miles into their hike when they heard footsteps behind them. Both men stopped, turning to look, but saw nothing. The silence that followed was thick, unsettling. Then, they saw him, a lone hiker standing in the distance, just beyond the bend of the trail. He was dressed in old, ragged clothes, his face partially hidden by a hood. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching them. Ben raised his hand, giving the stranger a friendly wave, but the man didn't respond. He simply turned and disappeared around the bend. "That was weird," Ben said, glancing at Charlie. "Probably just some local," Charlie replied, shrugging it off. "Let's keep going." But as they continued up the trail, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every so often, they'd catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, a flicker of a shadow, or the faint crunch of leaves behind them. It was as if the hiker was following them, always staying just out of sight. As night began to fall, they decided to make camp on a flat, open spot near a rocky outcropping. The sense of being watched had grown stronger, gnawing at their nerves. They tried to laugh it off, but both men knew something was wrong. After setting up their tents, they sat by the fire, eating in silence. That's when they heard it, a low growl coming from the shadows just beyond the light of the fire. They exchanged nervous glances, shining their flashlights into the darkness. The light caught a glimpse of eyes, glowing yellow and unblinking. Charlie leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "That's not normal." They watched, frozen, as the glowing eyes moved around the perimeter of their camp, circling them. Then, from the opposite direction, they saw another set of eyes. And another. The eyes seemed to multiply, surrounding their camp in a ring of silent watchers. Ben grabbed a rock, his hand shaking as he threw it toward the closest pair of eyes. The creature growled, retreating slightly, but the eyes continued to close in. "Let's get out of here," Ben muttered, packing up his gear in a rush. As they tried to leave, the creatures moved in closer, their shadows stretching into the firelight. Ben and Charlie knew they were being herded, forced into a narrow path through the trees, with the creatures following close behind. After an hour of walking, they saw him again, the hiker. This time, he was standing in the middle of the path, blocking their way. His head was tilted, his eyes fixed on them with an eerie intensity. "Are you lost?" Ben called out, his voice strained. The hiker didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward them, his face partially illuminated by the moonlight. As he stepped into the light, they could see his eyes glowing, a sickly yellow, inhuman and filled with malice. The hiker let out a low, guttural growl, his form shifting, contorting in ways that defied logic. His limbs stretched and twisted, his face elongating into something that was neither human nor animal. His clothes ripped as fur sprouted from his skin, and within moments, he had transformed into a grotesque, wolf-like creature. "Run!" Charlie shouted, pulling Ben as they bolted down the trail. The Skinwalker gave chase, its footsteps pounding against the ground, getting closer with each passing second. They didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting as much distance between themselves and the creature as possible. Ben and Charlie ran blindly through the forest, dodging trees and leaping over rocks, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. But no matter how fast they ran, the Skinwalker seemed to be right behind them, its growls growing louder, its breath hot on their necks. They finally stumbled upon a narrow ravine, its steep walls offering a temporary escape. Without hesitation, they scrambled down the slope, hiding behind a large rock as they tried to catch their breath. The Skinwalker's footsteps grew louder, echoing through the ravine as it searched for them. They could hear its low growls and the sound of claws scraping against rock as it prowled along the edge, sniffing the air. "We have to get out of here," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Charlie nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "We need a plan. We can't outrun it." Ben looked around, his eyes settling on a pile of loose rocks nearby. "Help me," he whispered, motioning toward the rocks. Together, they quietly stacked the rocks into a makeshift barrier, hoping it would at least slow the creature down. Just as they finished, the Skinwalker appeared at the top of the ravine, its eyes gleaming as it spotted them. It let out a deafening roar, leaping down toward them with a terrifying speed. They pushed the pile of rocks forward, sending them crashing down toward the creature. The rock struck the Skinwalker, knocking it off balance and causing it to stumble back. Taking advantage of the moment, Ben and Charlie scrambled out of the ravine, running as fast as they could. As they fled through the forest, the sounds of the Skinwalker's pursuit faded into the distance. They didn't stop until they saw the faint glow of dawn on the horizon, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees. Exhausted and bruised, they finally reached the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the ground. They looked back, expecting to see the creature watching them from the shadows, but the forest was silent. The Skinwalker was gone. They staggered back to their car, barely able to process the events of the night. As they drove away from the mountains, neither spoke, too shaken to put their terror into words. In the weeks that followed, Ben and Charlie tried to make sense of what had happened. They searched for any logical explanation, but every time they closed their eyes, they saw the creature's glowing eyes and heard its growls echoing through the trees. They knew they had encountered something beyond human understanding, something that defied logic and reason. They never returned to the Mogollon Mountains, warning anyone who would listen to stay away from those cursed peaks. And though they tried to move on, they were forever haunted by the memory of the Skinwalker and the terrible knowledge that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Jake and Emily Parker had always dreamed of owning a ranch. After years of saving, they finally purchased a piece of land in a remote part of northern Arizona, far from the bustling city life they were eager to leave behind. The ranch, sprawling and surrounded by dense forest, was everything they had hoped for, a quiet, peaceful place to raise their 2 young children and a few animals. But soon after moving in, strange events began to unfold. Eerie sounds echoed through the night, and livestock started disappearing without a trace. Neighbors, though few and far between, warned them of local legends, tales of a skinwalker that haunted the area, a shapeshifter that preyed upon isolated homes. Jake and Emily dismissed the stories as superstition. But as the nights grew colder, and the disturbances grew more frequent, they began to fear that their new home was far from peaceful. The strange occurrences started small. One night, Jake was woken by a soft scratching at the window. It was so faint that he barely noticed it, chalking it up to a tree branch brushing against the glass. But the next morning, he found deep scratch marks on the windowpane, as though an animal had tried to claw its way inside. He checked the trees around the house but found none close enough to reach the window. A week later, Emily noticed something strange as well. She was feeding their chickens when she noticed that one was missing. She searched the coop, but there was no sign of the bird, no feathers, no tracks, just an empty space where the chicken had been. Shrugging it off as an animal attack, she tried to put it out of her mind. But as the days passed, more animals began to vanish. Chickens, sheep, even their family dog disappeared one night, leaving no tracks or clues as to what had happened. The sense of dread around the ranch grew, each new disappearance gnawing at Jake and Emily's nerves. One night, after another chicken went missing, Jake decided to stay up and keep watch. He took his rifle and flashlight, sitting on the porch as the moonlight cast eerie shadows over the land. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. Around midnight, he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the edge of the property. He squinted into the darkness, his flashlight scanning the tree-line, but saw nothing. Just as he was about to turn away, he caught a glimpse of something moving, something large, hunched over, with glowing yellow eyes that stared back at him. It was a coyote, but larger than any he'd ever seen. Its eyes seemed almost intelligent, watching him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. He raised his rifle, but before he could take aim, the creature disappeared into the shadows. He sat there, frozen, unsure if what he'd seen was real. The growling continued, closer this time, and he could hear heavy footsteps approaching the barn. He ran toward the barn, his heart racing, but by the time he arrived, the creature was gone. In its place were deep claw marks on the barn door and fresh tracks in the dirt, tracks that looked both human and animal. The following nights were filled with similar disturbances. The sounds grew louder, the shadows longer. Emily began hearing whispers outside their bedroom window at night, soft and raspy, like someone calling her name. She tried to tell herself it was just the wind, but the voice sounded too clear, too purposeful. The children, too, began waking up at night, claiming they saw strange figures outside their windows. Jake dismissed it at first, thinking it was just their imagination. But as the sounds and sightings increased, he knew they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a wild animal. One evening, as he was checking the barn, he heard the voice. It was calling his name, echoing through the still night. He turned, and there, standing in the shadows, was the Skinwalker. It was tall, its form flickering between human and beast, with eyes that gleamed with malevolence. It let out a low snarl, stepping closer, and Jake backed away, his rifle shaking in his hands. The creature's face twisted into a grotesque smile, its eyes never leaving him. He fired a shot, but the creature dodged, moving faster than anything he'd ever seen. The Skinwalker let out a chilling laugh, retreating into the night, leaving Jake standing there, terrified and shaken. Realizing they couldn't ignore the threat any longer, Jake and Emily decided to take action. They spoke with a local elder who knew the stories of the Skinwalkers well. The elder warned them to be careful, to avoid provoking the creature, but he also gave them advice on how to protect their family and land. That night, Jake and Emily placed protective symbols around the house and built a fire pit in the center of the yard, lighting it as the sun set. They sat by the fire, watching the shadows, waiting for any sign of the creature. The children stayed inside, huddled together in fear, as the night stretched on. Around midnight, they heard the familiar growling, coming from all directions. The Skinwalker was there, watching, circling the property. Its figure flickered between shapes, a coyote, a wolf, a hunched figure with human-like features, each form more terrifying than the last. Emily grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it out as the creature moved closer, its yellow eyes reflecting the flames. Jake aimed his rifle, his finger steady on the trigger. The Skinwalker lunged, but as Emily swung the burning branch toward it, the creature recoiled, letting out an enraged scream. The flame seemed to weaken it, its form flickering and twisting as it backed away. "Get out!" Jake shouted, his voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. The skinwalker let out one final growl, its eyes narrowing with a look of pure hatred, before it disappeared into the darkness. The sounds faded, and the night grew silent once more. Though the skinwalker didn't return, Jake and Emily knew they would never feel completely safe on the ranch again. They took down the protective symbols, but every night, they kept a fire burning, just in case. The neighbors continued to speak of the skinwalker, warning newcomers to stay away from the area. The Parkers kept to themselves, reluctant to share their experience, knowing that most people wouldn't believe them. But every so often, they would hear a distant howl or see a flicker of movement in the tree line, a reminder that the skinwalker was still out there, watching, waiting. For Jake and Emily, the peace they had hoped to find on the ranch was forever haunted by the memory of the creature's twisted face, its glowing eyes, and the terrifying laughter that still echoed in their minds. They had survived, but they knew that some legends were more than just stories. They were warnings, ancient and deadly, passed down through generations to protect those who would listen. Chris, Maya, Jared, and Sophia were inseparable friends with a shared curiosity for the supernatural. On weekends, they'd often find themselves diving into ghost stories, exploring abandoned buildings, and testing the limits of urban legends. But one night, their interest in the paranormal led them down a dangerous path. One of them stumbled across an article about skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures from Native American folklore, known for their dark magic and terrifying ability to mimic animals or people. The article mentioned that people who attempted to summon a skinwalker often faced deadly consequences. Chris, ever the thrill-seeker, suggested they try a skinwalker ritual. The others were hesitant but eventually agreed, more curious than cautious. They didn't realize that their curiosity would bring a nightmare to life. On a chilly fall night, they met at Chris's house, gathered around a dimly lit table covered in candles and strange symbols they'd found in the article. They sat in a circle, each holding a small mirror and reciting a chant Chris had copied down. The chant was said to call forth a skinwalker, daring it to reveal itself to those who summoned it. The instructions warned them to stay inside a protective circle, to never look into each other's mirrors, and to leave an offering of meat outside the door as a sign of respect. Laughing nervously, they placed a small package of raw meat by the front door, following each step to the letter. As they finished the chant, a heavy silence filled the room. The air felt thick, and a strange chill crept over them. Chris laughed, breaking the tension, and they each exhaled, feeling both relieved and disappointed that nothing had happened. "See?" Chris said, smirking. "It's all just a story." But as he spoke, a soft scratching sounded at the window. The group fell silent, their eyes darting to the darkened glass. They heard it again, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like claws scraping against the windowpane. "Probably just a branch," Jared whispered, though his voice trembled. But Maya shook her head. "There aren't any trees that close to the window." The scratching grew louder, more insistent. And then, a low growl echoed from outside. "The haunting begins." They sat in silence, each too afraid to move, as the growling intensified, reverberating through the room. The sound was guttural, almost inhuman, and it sent chills down their spines. "Let's just end this," Sophia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to close the ritual." But Chris shook his head. "It's nothing. We're just freaking ourselves out." Suddenly, the growling stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the house. They could hear them moving from window to window, pausing occasionally as if someone, was watching them from the outside. Maya clutched her mirror, her knuckles white. "This isn't right," she whispered. "Something's here." The footsteps stopped, and the front door creaked open slightly, as though a draft had pushed it ajar. They all turned, staring at the door, hearts pounding. The offering of meat lay just outside the door, untouched. Chris stood up, moving to close the door, but before he could, a shadowy figure appeared at the threshold. It was tall, hunched over, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its face was twisted, caught between human and animal, its features shifting and contorting with each passing second. The group gasped, their fear turning to panic as the creature stepped forward, sniffing the air. It's the Skinwalker, Jared stammered, backing away. The creature's lips curled into a sneer, and it let out a low, menacing growl. It was as if it could sense their fear, feeding off their terror. They stumbled back, scrambling to lock the door, but the Skinwalker slammed its hand against the wood, leaving deep claw marks. The house rattled as the creature pounded on the walls, moving around the exterior, searching for a way in. The group huddled together, trapped, their minds racing for a way to undo the ritual. Maya frantically flipped through the article they'd printed, her hands trembling. There's no way to close it, she whispered, her voice filled with dread. Once you call it, it doesn't leave until it's taken something. Sophia's face paled. Taken something? Like what? Maya looked up, her eyes wide with fear. An offering. Or, a person. They sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The Skinwalker let out a scream, a high-pitched, unearthly sound that pierced through their ears. They covered their heads, feeling as though the creature's voice was reaching into their minds, filling them with terror. Maybe if we leave the house, it'll stop, Chris said, desperate. Maybe it's only here because we trapped it. The others hesitated, but with no better options, they agreed. They gathered their things and moved toward the back door, hoping to escape before the creature realized their plan. They opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air, and ran into the woods behind the house. The darkness enveloped them, but they didn't stop, their only focus on getting as far away from the creature as possible. But as they ran, they heard the sound of footsteps close behind them, heavy, thudding footsteps that grew louder with every step. The Skinwalker was chasing them, its distorted voice echoing through the trees, calling their names in a mocking, twisted tone. One by one, they stumbled, tripping over roots and rocks as they fled deeper into the forest. Jared fell, scraping his knee, and as he scrambled to his feet, he saw the creature's glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. He screamed, running faster, his heart pounding in his chest. They finally reached an old hunting cabin and ducked inside, slamming the door behind them. They huddled together, their breaths ragged, as they listened to the creature's footsteps outside. It circled the cabin, scratching at the walls, its laughter filling the small space with a sense of dread. The Skinwalker pounded on the door, each hit rattling the wood, as it hissed and growled, demanding they come out. The group held their breath, praying the creature would leave. Hours passed, and the Skinwalker's assault finally stopped. The silence was almost worse, leaving them on edge, afraid to move. Finally, as dawn began to break, they opened the door cautiously, peeking outside. The creature was gone, but the memory of its twisted face and mocking voice haunted them as they made their way back to Chris's house. They were silent, each one too shaken to speak, as they tried to comprehend what had happened. When they arrived, the house was undisturbed. The meat offering was still there, untouched, but the claw marks on the door remained, a haunting reminder of the nightmare they had unleashed. Conclusion. They vowed never to speak of the ritual again, each haunted by the memory of the Skinwalker's laugh, its mocking tone, and the feeling of being hunted. They returned to their lives, but the experience left them forever changed, knowing that some things were better left undisturbed. The Skinwalker had claimed its place in their minds, a dark presence that would linger forever, and a chilling reminder that their curiosity had come at a terrible price.